Fentanyl is their lottery ticket. They're going to make millions now with fentanyl, these dealers like in Ohio or whatever. But the problem with fentanyl is you can't, enough will get you high. It's like a little few grains of salt. A couple more will kill you. A death or an overdose is an advertisement, not a warning to an addicted brain. It's the most perfect example of the transformation that takes place in the human brain with regard to our instinct for self-preservation. To me, I have come to view the tents as spectacularly catastrophic, because all it really is doing in the end is providing a place for people to kill themselves.
Hello, I am B. Reeves with New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families. Thank you. Well, welcome to another episode of Finding New Waters. Today, we are very, very lucky. Special guest I had the pleasure of meeting recently in Charleston, South Carolina, author Sam Quinones. I'm sure I butchered it, but I did my best.
That's fine.
Welcome, Sam.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, before we start, I just want to just sort of say how I came to know who you were and then eventually met you.
Right.
About 7 years ago, a friend of mine took me to lunch to check on me and see how I was doing, put up to the task by my brother, I later found out. And we had lunch and he gave me a book, and I didn't look at what the book was while we were having lunch. I went home and looked at the book, a book called Dreamland, and it was about the opiate epidemic. I took one look at the subject matter and tossed it to the side. About 6 months later, I went to a treatment center and got sober and have been sober ever since. And I found out later that this friend had been sent by my brother, and after the lunch called my brother and said, he's not ready. And then about 2 years after I got sober, started working in this field, and the book, I came across the book. And then by then I was very interested in the subject matter. And then I read Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. So people can see it here. Which is just an absolutely fascinating true story written by Sam, who is a real old school crime reporter about, and I wanted him to talk about it. And then, so that book, I've been telling anybody who will listen to read it. I've been talking about it for 4 years plus. And then, I happened to be at a conference recently in Charleston where Sam was the speaker. And in the last 2 or 3 years, he's written a follow-up book about the, the synthetic drug epidemic, fentanyl and meth. But anyway, I got to meet him and we talked and I asked him to be on the podcast, and here we are. And I hope I don't talk again the rest of the hour. So tell us how you came across this subject matter and all that.
Sure. I'm actually joining you from Mexico, where I'm down here speaking to a group tomorrow of attorneys general, both from from U.S. states and from Mexican states. I lived many years in Mexico, 10 years in Mexico. My first 2 books, in fact, were about Mexico. From 1994 to 2004, I was down in Mexico. I came back in 2004 to write for the Los Angeles Times, got a job at the LA Times. And while I was there, I wrote mostly about Mexican-related stuff, speak fluent Spanish and all that. And along the way, I interviewed a DEA supervisor out of Phoenix who said that they were seeing an enormous new surge in heroin seizures in the last 3 years, something like that. And I was like, why would that be? That would be more people would be using heroin, but why would that be? Could not understand any of that. I thought heroin was from the 1970s. Right? Serpico, that great movie, French Connection, all those movies out in New York City. That was heroin for me. And so I began to look into this, and sure enough, I put together the first part of that Dreamland book that you showed is, or a significant part of the book is about a village in Mexico where a lot of the guys come north to sell heroin retail, like pizza, very much like a pizza delivery service. And I thought that was a fascinating story. And I got deep into it, went down to the town, et cetera. And, but I still could not understand why they would have such a new market for heroin. And the reason that I didn't understand that was because I had been in Mexico for the last 10 years. And during those 10 years is when you began to see what I call the opioid revolution in pain management of American medicine. And that's when you began to see doctors and pharmaceutical companies pushing the idea, pain specialists and pharma companies pushing the idea to primary care docs that they needed to treat pain much more aggressively. And the key tool in all this was one they had been afraid of using, and that was narcotic prescription painkillers. I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know anything about this pill called OxyContin. I'd never heard of it before. But when I came upon it, I realized that I had been focusing on the heroin story was actually the small story. I thought it was pretty big, but it was really the small story behind me, a story I didn't really understand at all until then, was this enormous transformation in American medicine of a very aggressive use of narcotic painkillers that really where all these doctors have been taught not to use them except for in extreme cases, very, 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 very well scrutinized, no big bottles going home of refills going home and stuff like that. And then all that changed beginning in the mid-90s, right? Just about the time I was in Mexico, all of that changed. And so I began to realize that this was this huge story and that no one had told the full story of how we came to be creating new heroin addicts. Starts with American pain management and pharmaceutical companies pushing this idea because they're the ones who make these pills, and all of that, gradually led to the Dreamland book that you showed. I didn't really know a thing about addiction. I really didn't want to write about addiction. I really just wanted to write about Mexican heroin traffickers. But you couldn't really write about Mexican heroin traffickers unless you were writing about the pain pills and the aggressive, astounding expansion of supply of these pills, inundating almost the entire, well, really the entire country. And so at that, I began to see this again, this was a huge story, wrote that story. The Dreamland book comes out. When I'm writing it, I encounter something very, very, well, at the time it was daunting. I encountered people not wanting to talk about it. Now, I had grown up as a crime reporter in a town in California, in the middle of the crack epidemic. This town, Stockton, California, was really, inundated with crack, and you couldn't avoid this problem. It was everywhere. The violence associated with crack was just in all these different neighborhoods, and it was not something people could avoid. But this one, people were, particularly encountered enormous silence among families with addicted loved ones. And nobody wanted to talk about it on the record. Nobody wanted to tell their stories. In the entire state of Ohio, I looked, I found 5 families. If you can imagine that, only 5 families wanted to talk about it. And so as I'm in the middle of all this, I'm thinking, how am I going to tell a story? This is crazy. Nobody's going to read this story, this book, because no one wants to talk about it. It's so silent. And I saw that's how it spread nationwide. It was really spreading nationwide because everybody was alone in their little bedroom, crying themselves to sleep with their arms around a photo album, but nobody wanted to talk about it at all. And so you get this nationwide silence. Families were just extraordinarily ashamed, mortified that their family members had ended up this way, not realizing that on probably their street or in their church or in their school, there was many cases just like them. And so when the book comes out, Dreamland comes out, all of that begins to change. And all these people begin to come out of the shadows into the light to tell their stories in many, many different ways. Could be at a city council meeting, could be on Facebook, could be in radio or TV or newspaper or whatever. But whatever the case, you begin to see lots more people telling this story, right? And that is when you begin to get much fuller. So about 2-3 years into it, after the book comes out, you are seeing by then much fuller recovery. Coverage of this problem in many of the major media who had to that point had really not done much about it. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, groups like this, had Time and so on, had not really done all that much. You did see a pretty significant coverage in the areas like Southern Ohio, West Virginia. You would see that there. Cincinnati paper had some good stuff, that kind of thing. But outside of that, it was really hard to find. And then you begin to see that you also, when I turned the book in, my manuscript in, there were no active lawsuits against drug companies. And within a couple, 3 years, there were hundreds of these lawsuits. And then there were now thousands after that. As you said, the subtitle to my book is True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. That's because nobody outside of medicine knew what an opioid was. That was a term that nobody knew. And I knew this from talking to people. They had no idea what this was. And so I had to put opiate in the subtitle because if I put opioid, everyone being like, what is that? Nobody knew how to pronounce the word naloxone. All right, back then, if you're not a paramedic or an ER doc or something, you didn't really know how to pronounce it. And the other astounding thing, I think always, is that when my agent took my book proposal that was later called Dreamland, around to all these publishers in New York City, I think it was like a dozen or something like that, only one wanted a book on that topic. And they gave me an advance, not a huge one at all. And within 2 or 3 years, you would see like bidding wars for books about the opioid epidemic. And so all of this began to change. And along the way, then they pushed me to do another book, and that led to another book that I ended up doing called The Least of Us, which is about the fentanyl and the fentanyl and meth problem. Because as Dreamland came out, I kind of lived this transformation myself. First of all, I'd seen what it was like in the days when nobody wanted to talk about it. I lived that in very personal and visceral ways. But then after the book comes out, I begin getting all these invitations to come speak all across the country. And so from September, I did the counting one time, September of 2015, 3 or 4 months after the book comes out, until February of 2020 when COVID hits, I did 265 speeches, just unreal number of speeches, because I had written 2 books that are magnificent books about Mexico. They're fantastic books. I love my 2 books about Mexico, but no one read them. So when all of a sudden you get people saying, yeah, hey, come on, talk to us, come, we'll pay you, come on out. And I'm like, hell yeah, I'll go. And so I just took all these events and did them. But it was also a reflection of how the country was changing. All of a sudden, the story was breaking, and people understood that it was nationwide and that they were certainly not alone. And along the way, as I was doing those speeches, I began to see the story itself was changing. It was no longer, doctors were far more reluctant to prescribe, and sometimes way too reluctant. Sometimes they should have prescribed and they did not. That's a whole other topic to talk about. But fentanyl and methamphetamine were taking the place of these pills in terms of just massive supply, and all of that was coming out of the trafficking world in Mexico. And fentanyl became nationwide about, I would say, 2018, 19, right in there. You begin to see it all over the country. So this was kind of, as I was speaking, as I was in the middle of all this, living all this, I was astounded because I knew when I wrote the book that no one was ever going to read Dreamland. And turns out it had this enormous effect. Along the way,
I just want to assure you real quick, though, that yes, people were ready. Sorry to talk over, but I just want to assure you that yes, people were ready to hear about the opiate epidemic, but the book is so well written, so well researched, and the confluence of events. I mean, you start from the history of the poppy seed through the present up to 2016 or so, whenever it came out. But but also something that really stood out to me was this paradigm shift where there was now this subjective vital sign of how much pain somebody believed he or she was in versus, blood pressure and oxygen and things that were objective. That coupled with the idea that everybody was entitled to be pain-free, coupled with the pharmaceutical companies doing all this phony marketing and lying to everybody about it not being addictive. All of those things kind of had to happen for all this thing to happen the way it did. So it's not just that people were starting to wake up, which you were a big part of helping people say that, you know what, I'm not ashamed. And if this is going to help somebody else for me to say that my son or daughter or dad is died of opiate addiction or overdose, you helped a lot of people with that. But the book itself and the research and the way it's all tied together. And then of course the heroin that came in to sort of supplant that, the opiates that were no longer being prescribed, all these people who were addicted, is just absolutely fascinating. And then furthermore, the fact that the Nayarit, is that the state in Mexico where they were?
Right.
Yeah. So they come in, and instead of going to your traditional cities like New York and Philadelphia, where there's already a crime syndicate, where the heroin trade was already kind of, there was no territory for them. They went to these mid-sized cities. It was just everything about it is fascinating. And of course it leads to what you're talking about now. I just want to make sure I gave you credit for that.
Those guys were the new kind of heroin. Exactly. I remember the first guy I talked to. What I do frequently as a reporter is when I'm writing crime stories, I write to people in prison who may have something to do with whatever the topic is. So these guys were very easy to arrest in Columbus and Portland and in various towns. They were very easy to arrest because they were going around selling heroin to little, they were selling it like pizza. So you'd have a operator standing by, and the addict would call up and you would say, I need 5, and so they would call a driver who was driving around a big mouthful, looked like a hamster, of little balloons filled with 1/10 of a gram doses of black tar heroin and more in a hidden part of the car, and a big bottle of water to guzzle down all those balloons when the cops stop them. Okay. And so they would drive around and they would do this. So they were easy to arrest, but the system, that they looked like the most minor, small scale, nobody heroin dealers you can imagine, except they were part of this massive network of dealers. And so you would arrest, say, a local law enforcement would arrest, say, 10 or 15 of these guys in some big sweep, and within 2 weeks, the whole network would be reconstituted. But there were a lot of a lot of these guys went to prison. And so I got lists of people who went to prison under these cases and wrote to, and they're all Spanish speakers, they're all Mexican. And so I speak Spanish. I'm right in Mexico. I'm Cancun right now. I sent letters to all these guys. So I must have sent like 30 letters. Hey, do you want to talk about your pizza delivery / heroin system or whatever? And here I am. I do this. I've lived there and speak Spanish, blah, blah, blah. And only one guy called me back. But you know what? You only need one. And he was the one who said, yeah, we're all from this little town called Jalisco in the little tiny state of Nayarit. 10 years living in Mexico. I had never been to Nayarit, didn't really know much about it. And he was the one who told me, we were all from this town, and he had been working out of Columbus, Ohio, which was, the system starts really in the San Fernando Valley of LA. Second big hub is Portland, Oregon. Third big hub beginning late 90s, 98, so right in there, is Columbus, Ohio. And this guy was arrested there. And so he tells me, in this long conversation that we had, it was just beautiful. He tells me that we're with the town they're all from, but then also, I asked him, well, did you go to New York City? And he sounded on the phone like I must have been some kind of idiot. Like, why would we go to New York or Baltimore? Man, they got guns there. No, we're looking for towns with no competition. We're farm boys. That's all they are. They are not guys trying to be the next Scarface. They're just kind of trying to make some money, and this is kind of the way they do it. And so Cincinnati, Lexington, Indianapolis, Charlotte, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Boise, Salt Lake City, Reno, on these kinds of towns are where they had set up. And what really brought them and allowed them to hugely expand their system was this expansion of pain pill prescribing that was along the way creating many opioid addicts. And so they began to see that their heroin was a fifth the price. The high was much greater and lasted longer. And so a lot of people began switching to their black tar heroin. And the first place they really recognized it, they were really the first ones to understand that the expansion of prescription pain pill prescribing, the way it had happened in just this staggering and unrelenting way over 15 years, was resulting in brand new populations in all these different towns of heroin addicted consumers, and that their system was perfectly designed to deal with those folks, because these were kind of, a lot of times they were kids who were middle class, or they were just people who were not used to the street too much. And so going into some very sketchy motel or some very sketchy bar or housing project was not what they were into. So they were providing this real service for the heroin addict, which was reliability. Every time you call, I'll be there for you. That's huge, huge in the addict world. Number two is, I'll meet you where you are so you don't have to risk your life. But that meant is that your addiction is going to go off the rails, because now you can get it anytime you want, all the time. And that's also what happened because of these guys. But they were the drug dealer that responded to this new kind of drug problem that was not so much based on like some sketchy motel, for example, but doctors' offices and athletic locker rooms and all the rest.
And those guys, for the most part, if I remember correctly, were not users or addicts themselves. They were just straight business. So they were always available, and they weren't ripping people off. And they were reliable, like you said, which is, for a drug addict, there's nothing better.
They understood that reliability and being there, even if you're 20 minutes late, it's the reliability. You can call this guy and he will show up. It might be 20 minutes late, but he will show up. They understood the nature of the customer base and what they needed. And they also understood that sometimes their customers didn't have any money and would rob them. But that did not keep them from selling to them again next time, because they knew they grew to understand, because they were fully immersed in satisfying the heroin addicted customer. And they understood that this was part of the cost of doing business. And sometimes they grew to be friends with these guys. And there was a lot of different kinds of stories that took place, but it was a customer service. What they were mostly providing to a newly heroin addicted population was the kind of customer service that a heroin addict needs.
Right. And so starting, people were always doing heroin from time immemorial, or opiates on some level. So then we have the opiate epidemic before, it's here in silence long before, light was shown on it by you and others. And then this leads to this new black tar heroin epidemic. But all in, Americans in general there's a whole new crop of addicts, opiate addicts in general, which then now back to where we were before I interrupted you, is fentanyl is lurking in the background, right? Where you're starting to see this while you're getting Dreamland out, there's already something else, right?
Exactly. And what I came to find out, so my publisher said, you got to write another book. And I was first reluctant because I was exhausted. My little brain was like packed with Dreamland detail and stuff. And so I said, well, we'll see. And then I realized, what do you do, because this is changing. As I got into the book, I realized it had to be about synthetic drugs. And this was itself a total revolution, because I had lived in Mexico. I had never really written much about drugs. When I lived in Mexico, I mostly wrote about immigration and political change. I was a freelance writer. I didn't want to deal with the drug issue because I didn't have any backup I didn't have like a big major media corporation backing me up. I was a freelancer. I was independent. I was all on my own. It's just me. That was it. So I let that topic go for other people. But I also have to say that it was not the issue that it later became with the violence that erupted. It erupted about 2 years after I left Mexico, and I couldn't believe it. So anyway, I was not writing about that so much. Along the way, though, as I got into this book and I began to realize that fentanyl and synthetic drugs were the thing, synthetic drugs being drugs that are made only with chemicals, no plants involved. And I realized this was a revolution in Mexico because all the original traffickers, and for a lot of years after that, they all came from the earth. They all came from ranches, farms. That's who they were. And then all of a sudden they realized growing your own drugs is not very profitable. It's more risky. So less risk, more profit by concocting your own drug. What you need then are chemicals, and you get chemicals from the world chemical markets and the ports that are in Mexico. Most of this stuff, the chemicals come from China. Along the way, I realized that there was a moment. See, the Mexican drug cartel world had discovered methamphetamine many years prior, and they knew this idea that if you can make your own drug, much better than growing it. And they learned that with meth. We can talk about meth later, but fentanyl, along the way, as they're providing black tar heroin to the heroin addict world, newly created in the United States, they come upon, through a guy I talk about in The Least of Us, a couple of chapters about this one guy, an underground chemist, Mexican guy who grew up really in the United States, learned to make fentanyl up there, went to prison, learned how to make it better, got out, was deported back to Mexico, hired by the Sinaloa cartel to really make ephedrine, the chemical then used to make methamphetamine. He says, no, I know better than these guys. They put him up. They pay lots of money to put him up in a big company with fancy glassware and all the rest. And he begins to make fentanyl. They hear about this. They get mad. What are you doing? We want you to make ephedrine. And he sits them down and he explains to them, no, you don't understand. Fentanyl, this drug that I made for you, is the most potent, the most profitable drug you will ever encounter in your life. You can cut this kilo 50 times and it'll still be sellable on the street. Now, on the street, people listen to stuff like that and they laugh. That's just some guy trying to sell bunk. But in this case, you could cut 1 kilo of his fentanyl 50 times and you would still get people high on the street. And when they begin to realize this, the light goes on in the minds of this one group within the Sinaloa drug cartel that hired him. And from that point on, the Mexican drug trafficking world understood that there was this thing that they had first called heroina sintética, synthetic heroin. It was fentanyl. And that this guy turned them onto it, and they saw the enormous profit and the much reduced risk, because you no longer have to pay farmers. You don't need the irrigation. You don't need exposed farms or anything like that. You just make it in a small little enclosed area, maybe backyard, even whatever, depending. And you could make fentanyl, and it was very, very potent. And so it made all this sense, just like meth made a whole lot more sense to people than growing your drugs. You just make it. Right, and they came to understand this through this one chemist, and that episode, that chemist, a guy named Ricardo Valdez Torres, also known as El Cerebro, the brain, was a guy who his fentanyl that he began sending in significant quantities to these Sinaloa guys. The Sinaloa guys would send it up to the Chicago gangs, through which they mostly sent their dope. And these guys began to sell it. Over the next 9 months, this was beginning in the fall of 2005 into the spring of 2006, this lab was functioning about that long, that was the first time you really see a mass die-off to fentanyl. You see thousands of people die, and then the drug goes from Chicago. They send it to St. Louis. They send it to Detroit, Philly, Camden, etc. You begin to see all these people dying, and then when the DEA and the Mexican military bust this lab, the deaths stop. And so you kind of see the effect of what happens when you reduce supply. This is the first example of supply reduction being harmed. perhaps the most important form of harm reduction, in fact. And so after that, though, people knew fentanyl, and then not long after that, the Chinese chemical companies begin making it and advertising it on the web. And
hey, back up. What year? This is like 2006, right? When this early, and then kind of, will you just do like sort of a chronology of fentanyl for people?
Sure. Yeah, it was invented in 1960 by Paul Janssen, a Belgian chemist, wonderful scientific mind. Fentanyl is an absolute revolutionary anesthetic. It is. I've had fentanyl. I had a heart attack, and I had fentanyl, and it is a wonderful surgical anesthetic, revolutionary and life-saving. It and one reason for that is it takes you in and out of anesthesia very, very quickly. Both you're in and you're out, and it's easy to manipulate on the part of the anesthesiologist. So, and then for several years, many decades, there occasionally you'd see some chemists, underground chemists, make a pound or two, and then it would fade away and all that kind of stuff. And in '06 is when this lab was finally busted. It lasted about 9-10 months, killed a lot of people. The first time we saw fentanyl, first time DEA agents actually had to know what fentanyl was around then. And then in 2013, 14, 15, right in there, you begin to see chemical companies in China begin to sell this and advertise that they can send it through the mail. And you began to see Mexicans buying it, but also, maybe even more importantly at that point, drug dealers, pill and heroin dealers in the opioid states, the ground zero for the opioid epidemic, like Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, places like that, they begin to buy the stuff online and get it sent to them, but it's coming in very small quantities. You're getting a quarter pound of fentanyl or something like that. It comes in a manila envelope sent through the snail mail, and so it gets lost in the millions of packages that come from abroad into the United States, that kind of thing. And these guys are also idiots. They don't know how to. Fentanyl is their lottery ticket. They're going to make millions now with fentanyl, these dealers like in Ohio or whatever. But the problem with fentanyl is you can't, enough will get you high. It's like a little few grains of salt. A couple more will kill you. And so they can't sell that on the street. So they needed to mix it. But they don't know how to mix drugs. This is the only drug that really in the history of drug use in America, we've actually had to mix it to make profit off of it. They don't know what they're doing. And so the myth, I write about this in the least of it's the myth comes up, spreads that the best way to mix your drugs, your fentanyl, with another powder that is, doesn't do anything, very cheap powder, whatever it happens to be, lactose or whatever. Anyway, the best way to do that is with a magic bullet blender, which is crazy. A magic bullet blender is for mixing liquids. It's got that blade. Blades are for mixing liquids. This is powder. So what would end up happening was they would mix it. It would mix it really poorly. And then what you would see is what you began to see in places like Cincinnati and Akron and Huntington, West Virginia, and some other places. You began to see mass overdoses all on like one weekend, 50 or 70 or something like that. You began to see this. These were the first headlines associated with fentanyl. This would be 2014, 15, right in 16, right in there. And then as time went on, the Mexicans began to realize, why are we buying fentanyl from the Chinese? Why don't we just buy the chemicals? They learned how to make it, and what they buy the chemicals in ports that they control to the extent that they need to get these chemicals, these illegal chemicals, and chemicals used to make fentanyl. They begin to make it. And that is when, again, fentanyl is a game changer. It changed the game when it began coming from China. And then the second real huge change was when Mexican trafficking groups began to make it down in Mexico from ingredients that they bought from China, but they came to Mexico and was made into fentanyl. But with that, they were able to make supplies of fentanyl that just boggled the mind, and they spread nationwide. And no longer was it coming in quarter pounds in a little manila envelope. It was kind of multi-kilos and all this kind of stuff. And this was part of the synthetic revolution that took place in the Mexican trafficking world, and that as we are living with today.
Why is China the hotbed of the ingredients versus anywhere else in the world?
Most likely because China, there's a lot of, I don't know exactly why, but China has thousands of chemical companies now. Used to be there were only a few. They learned how to make fentanyl back from Paul Janssen. Paul Janssen signed an agreement with the Chinese government in 1985 to produce fentanyl in Mexico and license it. And so he would get profits off of it, but they would make it. So they've known how to make fentanyl since the 80s. And they've learned what chemicals are needed since then as well, I'm assuming anyway. And so I'm sure they could get it elsewhere, but I think that there was, a wide number of chemical companies that made it. I think perhaps don't have any reporting on this, but wouldn't surprise me if the attitudes with regard from the Chinese authorities were kind of laissez-faire when it comes to this kind of stuff. Like, we don't really care how much drugs you sell to the rest of the world. Just don't make sure you don't sell it here, kind of thing. There's something to that, I suspect. Although, again, I haven't done any reporting on it. And I think they began to develop these relationships. And eventually, it was like a one-stop shop. China was like a one-stop shop for a lot of these guys. And so they began to, they had this kind of connection, this relationship that developed and grew stronger over the years. You still can get, I don't know this, but I know that for, like, say, methamphetamine, you can buy chemicals to make methamphetamine from many different countries, but you got this funnel, and so it's easier to use it. That's my hunch anyway.
What is the fentanyl epidemic limited in scope to North America? Is it worldwide?
Well, yes, for now.
Okay.
Yes. Say it's in Canada, certainly. It also is in Mexico, much as the Mexican government would like to ignore or deny this. And the last president of Mexico spent a lot of energy saying that we don't have any role in the production of fentanyl, and that's just complete nonsense. And there is now a fentanyl problem. There was a great story in the LA Times in 2000, I believe it was 23, which told the story of the medical examiner for the city of Mexicali, who was concerned about fentanyl. And the problem is that medical examiners, unlike in the United States, they don't do toxicology tests on corpses. So they don't test for what's in someone's bloodstream. So Mexican president was saying, we don't have a problem here with fentanyl, but nobody in Mexico is testing the corpses for fentanyl. This medical examiner for 1 year, June of 22 to June of 23 is what I think it was. He tested all the bodies for drugs, for fentanyl, basically. He found that 23% of the corpses that came through his office for autopsies had fentanyl present in the body. So it seems to me that there is a very big problem in Mexico with this stuff, which makes sense because they're making it there. And this is really all about supply creating demand. Opioids in general, in my opinion now, are about supply creating demand. It's not the reverse.
Well, one thing I've heard you talk about, and I think I've read, where you've written it, and I know we talked about it, or at least I heard you in your talk in Charleston, and something that comes up in my line of work and even on this podcast is this idea that, and people are shocked by it, when people start ODing, what do addicts do, Sam?
Right.
They go right for it, right?
Get more.
Right.
Who sold that guy his dope? I'm going there. And it's because it's a perfect illustration of the immense power of these drugs, opioids especially, and we can talk about why that is, but opioids especially, to transform our brain chemistry and transform our brain and mute or squelch, at least temporarily, the instinct for self-preservation. So this guy died. Well, geez, I got to go find that dope because I'm not going to die. But man, that must be powerful dope. It's an advertisement. A death or an overdose is an advertisement, not a warning to an addicted brain. It's the most perfect example of the transformation that takes place in the human brain with regard to our instinct for self-preservation. We just lose it. And you can see that too every day in, say, tent encampments all across the country. You see these tent encampments, lethal temperatures, people being beaten, women being raped, feces, horribly unsanitary. Hey, I've got treatment for you. I've got a bed. I've got warmth. My moms come by. Please, honey, come with me. People say, no, I'm staying. It tells you how powerfully these drugs squelch our very, very important instinct for self-preservation. If we had that squelched, if that's how we were evolved, if we would never have survived as a species, right? The human race would never have survived. It's a remarkable thing to watch, but I'm always struck by how it's a perfect illustration of how these drugs squelch, and in particular, these drugs in enormous quantities with very high potency. That combination where it's always in your face, always available, that combination really means that the story is about supply creating demand and then exacerbating or continuing demand. It's not about demand creating supply. I think that the opioid story, beginning with the pills to fentanyl, through fentanyl, is really about supply creating addicted demand, and then it goes from there, and it prolongs it and exacerbates it.
Yeah, and to your point about your own experience with your heart condition and fentanyl being used in a medical setting with an anesthesiologist, in and out, and so on a smaller level, the addicts who use fentanyl, they get really, really high for a short period of time. So they are constantly having to use, right?
Absolutely. And this is what makes fentanyl such a great, in quotes, drug for drug dealers. Because that person who uses cocaine every 2 weekends, every couple of times a month, you put fentanyl in this cocaine, pretty soon, if that guy doesn't die, pretty soon he's a fentanyl addict. Has to use 4 or 5 times a day. He bought from you once or twice a month. Now he's buying from you 4, 5, 6 times a day. In Tucson, very close to Mexico, of course, very close to the source of supply. When I was down there about a few months ago, they were saying, we have people now smoking fentanyl counterfeit pills, which are another form that fentanyl comes in from Mexico. They make them into counterfeit Percocets or Xanax bars or oxycodone generics or whatever. And so all they contain is fentanyl. But you're finding people in Tucson smoking pills 50 to 80 a day. That means all day long you are looking or smoking fentanyl, but you cannot be away from it because why? Because it lasts so short a period of time. It's boom, boom. You're never more than like an hour and a half or 2 hours from very, very savage withdrawals. And it's terrifying. And that's why people in tent encampments say, no, I'm fine. I don't want. They're terrified of being away from these drugs because they know that the withdrawals are just beastly, even though they know that with every hit, they risk death. It's death-defying kind of thing. But they're in this little tent encampment, a world where everyone kind of knows them, even though calling it home is really a big stretch, in my opinion. Nevertheless, they're like all kind of part of the same little world, and no one can see the ability to break away from it, even at the risk of their own death, which they know will happen.
The encampment thing has come up a couple of times. So in these encampments, which is somewhat of a new phenomenon in the last 10 years or so. We've always had Skid Row and homeless people and that kind of thing. But
yeah,
what would you say the breakdown is? Is it in terms of percentage wise meth versus opiates, which is by now default fentanyl, because we don't even,
Yeah.
In our treatment center, we rarely see anybody who's an opiate addict who's not, it's always fentanyl now. But
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
back to the encampment, like what's the breakdown? Is it
Well, I would say
mostly?
that both those drugs are almost equally prevalent. And that's the other huge change with synthetic drugs. If you read the history of drug use in America, you'll see that there's like these cycles historians identify. Stimulants, and then Americans want depressants, and these cycles go like this, and for every 10 or 12 or 15 years, whatever that's. Okay, fine. What synthetic drugs have done is do away with those cycles because those drugs are coming together now, or they're mixed together either in Mexico, although I think it's more commonly that it's done in the United States, but certainly they're sold together in supplies that cover the country. So I think it's impossible to really separate those two. And in fact, they both add to the business model. Methamphetamine comes in such enormous potency that drives people now to rapid symptoms of schizophrenia. Meth-induced psychosis is an absolute part of street life today and absolute part of homelessness. Sometimes creating homelessness. People end up using meth and end up homeless. I wrote about that with 3 chapters in the Least of Us, a town called Clarksburg, West Virginia, had no homeless people until the meth from Mexico began showing up in the quantities it did. But then also the meth, once you're on the street, for whatever the many complicated reasons there are for people becoming homeless, once you begin using it, it's very hard to break out of it and move out of that very deep hole. So these two drugs are coming together. They are creating demand for each other. Once you're homeless, using meth actually makes a little bit of sense because you can stay up at night, prevent yourself from getting robbed, beaten, raped, all that kind of stuff. Of course, it also drives you out of your mind, and you're seeing that all across this country, and particularly in homeless encampments. And I would say those 3 things came about around the same time. You begin to see tents being used. This all emanates, in my opinion, from Skid Row in LA. Skid Row in LA used to be places where people slept in cardboard boxes. It was mostly people addicted to crack, alcohol, that kind of thing. And that was the way it was for an awful long time, pushing shopping carts. There was no stationary sense to the lives, which looked brutal. On the other hand, then people began handing out tents or giving away tents for free. Some of them would shoplift them, whatever the way is. People began to use tents. Then there were a number of court cases that said the police could not confiscate these tents. And anyway, that's a whole long story. I wrote about it in a piece that I'm happy to send you a link to, and you can put it in your website if you like. But what ends up happening is the tent model of homelessness takes root first in Skid Row, LA, and then spreads to other parts of Los Angeles. You begin to see it in 2012, 13, 14 with these court cases. The court cases allow for tents to kind of stay, and that begins to spread. So you see it in other parts of California, up into the Northwest, and so on. You begin to see tents as becoming kind of the nature of homelessness in America, based in large part on the idea that tents are better to weather the elements, which of course they are, and based on these court cases that kind of prevent police or cities, they think anyway, from doing much about it. And so they begin to spread. The problem is they're spreading at the same time that methamphetamine and then fentanyl are going nationwide. And so they become, in their stationariness, they become places for deep drug addiction and overdose and all the exploitation that would take place, that would not have happened if people are actually moving around from point A to point B every day, shopping cart, refrigerator box, whatever. Now they become places where criminal elements can avoid. So gun running, drug dealing, pimping is a big one, huge one. All of these things. Of course, you get vectors of disease. In Skid Row, LA, they had literally typhus. I mean, that's from the 17th century. You know what I mean? That's a disease that was in this. I mean, it's just amazing to me. I think it's 1700s, actually. So these 3 things kind of combine to both keep people homeless And then fentanyl comes along and makes it just the killing fields, people just dying in droves, but then more people getting addicted because fentanyl's everywhere. And then meth driving them to all kinds of psychosis and this kind of thing. Meanwhile, cities, particularly in the West Coast, but really in other places too, people feel like they can't do much about these things, and so they just let them go. During COVID, of course, the idea was we can't disperse these folks because they will infect other, they will infect. And people, in my feeling, that probably was like a mistake. On the other hand, it was I do cut people like in public health a lot of slack with that, because there was no precedent for any of this. No one knew how to deal with a pandemic, for goodness sake. So all of that, though, these three things kind of combine, along with the court cases, fentanyl, meth, and tents. And you begin to see these things all over, and especially in the western side of the United States, but elsewhere as well. And they kind of feed on each other. To me, I have come to view the tents as a spectacularly catastrophic thing. It's just a phenomenon, because all it really is doing in the end is providing a place for people to kill themselves.
Right. It's a petri dish for addiction, disease, like you said, crime. I mean, yeah. And it's, for now, there's not a whole lot being done about it.
Also, it gives people who are not part of that world a very, very negative, like people with the opioid epidemic, people across America, affected so many people across America, wanted to rethink addiction. They wanted to, I've thought about it this way. Maybe it's time for me to think about it some other way. Well, the tents, the drugs, the inability to do much about the tents gave people a reason not to rethink addiction.
That is such a great point, because it goes from that like brown paper bag, bum under a bridge, for years of destigmatizing and reframing it. And we finally get to a point where we see that the addict can be your next door neighbor in suburban America. But now that stereotype kind of comes back full circle, is the tent culture.
Right. And I've often thought methamphetamine had a lot to do with that as well, because if you really think about it, and so I wrote in the least of us, methamphetamine is the final rawest face of addiction. It is absolute obedience to drugs, absolute disintegration of the individual and the personal will and the rational will. And it is also scary to watch. People out of their minds. So ERs had to arm, not well, sometimes with weapons, but mostly protect their ER. So I wrote about Columbus ER in Columbus, Ohio, where they had to put armaments over all the wires so that people don't hang themselves or hurt others. And they used to have a Sunday afternoon, they would put the Browns football game or the Cincinnati Bengals football game on in the waiting room, where they had to stop that because people would come in out of their minds, ferocious, seeing Martians, seeing all kinds of hallucinations, and ready to do battle with threats that they perceived from nurses or other people in the ER or what have you. We began to see addiction kind of with meth as it really, really is, in a very kind of almost metaphorical sense. Here's this guy who is wandering around out of his mind, obedient to only one thing. And that is that is what addiction is. And a lot of people took it that way, and everyone's terrified of those folks. It's not like you have any sympathy for a guy who's screaming, half naked, running down, pounding on light posts and all that kind of. Everyone's like terrified of that guy. It was a confirmation for a lot of people of what addiction actually is, when in fact we had just spent a number of years, as I said, and you said, reconsidering what addiction actually is, and understanding that it could happen to literally every single human being. Every person we meet in the street could be that addict eating from the trash, and we wanted to feel something. We wanted to change how we thought. And then it was awfully difficult with methamphetamine on the street.
Yeah. Well, and this might be a nice segue. I know you've got to get out of here soon, and I wanted to make sure we talked about your upcoming book. And one thing you know, sort of ending here on this absolute extreme end of what addiction can look like. And, you know, they say addiction is the opposite of connection and that absolute loneliness, you know, and I know what that's like, you know, and even when I was at Thanksgiving with my family or, you know, in a crowd of people at a concert or a party, or I was still very alone, you know, and that the extreme end of that is when you don't even know who you are anymore and, you know, walking around half naked, punching light poles. And something I heard you talk about, I don't know if you have a name for this, your next book yet. But I know it's about the tuba and tuba players. And one thing when you were explaining it was just that it takes the opposite of addiction, which is connection. And it's a group effort and learning and being part of a band. So I wanted to end today on you talking about your upcoming book and just sort of tie it
Sure.
together and take us
I
home.
just finished it. I just literally like a couple of days ago just finished it. I had written for 12 years about this search, the addictive search for one's own demise, for finding happiness from some piece of crap that you buy, but which is really the lesson of American capitalism today. They want you to learn that too. You know, you can find happiness by buying this or that or this or that, you know. And the addiction is only the far extreme of what we're being indoctrinated to believe through our corporate marketers in this country. Anyway, I was worn out, 12 years of writing about this topic and really wear you out. And I said, I want to write about people who are not finding happiness from some easy purchase of something that's supposed to give them happiness and actually ends up killing them. I want to write about people who are, through great effort, through great preparation, discipline, are creating fulfillment from within, right? Who are not sitting around going, I want to find happiness somewhere else. I can create my own happiness, my own fulfillment, my own deep, deep contentment, right? And I had actually written at the LA Times about the tuba in the Mexican immigrant world of Los Angeles. Tuba is a huge, huge popular instrument in the Mexican immigrant world. I wrote 2 stories about this. It was an enormous popularity. I grew up in LA, but I grew up in LA during the 70s. Everybody played guitar. Now in the Mexican immigrant world in LA, it's the tuba. You know, it's big, big deal. Right. And so that got me interested in the tuba. I don't play it, never was in marching band, but I began to interview all these tuba players because I thought, when I've long felt that whenever you find a subculture of people who are doing something productive and positive for the pure love of it, regardless of whether they know they will never be famous, they know they will never be rich. It's hard enough just to make a middle-class career out of the tuba, yet they find this joy, they find what they are capable of. The tuba shows them what they are capable of, and they devote long hours to learning it in spite of repeated failure. They overcome failure. The failure is part of life. Well, they learn that lesson on the tuba. And so I begin to think I had done a bunch of interviews with tuba players, interviewed most of the top tuba players in America. And before this, and my agent said, maybe you should, the Least of Us was finished. I was worn out on the drug thing, frankly. I wanted to write about the positive side, something of people creating. And she said, why don't you just see what book you could write about the tuba? And I said, hey, that's a good idea. So I began to interview more tuba players all over the country, not just Mexican, but all styles and places in the country, and began to write about just this very thing that, you know, if you think about it, the tuba is the opposite of addiction. Addiction is about immediate gratification. It's eventually, addiction to opioids is eventually about stifling that beautiful, precious breath that is so essential to life. That life-giving breath, you stifle it. That's what an opioid overdose is. And the tuba is about cultivating that, strengthening that, making sure that's as powerful as it could possibly be. So you create with this one little very unpleasant sounding buzz through the mouthpiece. You go like that, right? And through the tuba, it vibrates, and then it comes out that bell with such power it can shake bones and the room that you're sitting in almost. It's a remarkable idea of creativity. Right. At the same time, I was also writing about band directors, because band directors, marching band, I never was in marching band as a kid, but marching band really is the place where you learn the most important values to the sustenance of community. You learn focus, patience, teamwork, collaboration, so important, those two. You learn to work through the discipline and all that kind of stuff. Tuba and band directors. One band director said, tuba is just band is just tuba on a much bigger scale. And I really came to believe that. So I wrote a book exalting, I guess you could say, exalting creativity, exalting hard work. In fact, the name of the book is The Perfect Tuba, and the subtitle is Finding Fulfillment from the bass horn and band, hope and hard work. I wanted to exalt hard work as a way of saying, this is really how human beings always have moved forward and become content, is putting in hard work and working on something and perfecting it in spite of failure. So it became a book of stories about tuba players and band directors. You know, it just was a very weird idea, but believe me, I know people are listening going, what the hell is he talking about? But you know, it's so important to who we are, where we are as a country now, that people continue to understand these important lessons of community that the tuba and band directors can teach. We are in the middle of an economy, a culture, a commercial culture that promotes the ideas of addiction, cravings, the Lux Cravings box by Taco Bell, you know, gambling apps, porno, video games, smart media, forget about it, TikTok and all that crud. You know, you get all of this blasted at you, and we need somebody to come along and say, you know what? Postponing gratification is very, very important. Discipline is very, very important. Working with others, all of that stuff is how you sustain community, how you create attitudes that sustain community. And that, it was weird. I did not start out writing a sequel to my other two books, Dreamland and The Least of Us, but in the end, The Perfect Tuba became like the perfect sequel. Weirdly enough, man.
It makes sense too, because you are writing about this thing that's kind of, you know, not that sexy, the tuba, and people do it for the love. But the thing is, you're doing that too by writing about it, which is a beautiful thing because you love writing about it and you love what you do. And you could have easily gone to, you know, a more logical conclusion in terms of a sequel to find another drug, you know, hot topic thing, but you chose something that you found interesting because you love doing it.
You know, it's
awesome.
It's weird you say that, B. I came to that same conclusion. Nobody chooses the tuba. The reason you play the tuba is because you were late for band class first day of seventh grade. That's usually why. Nobody sits, very few people go, I got to play the tuba, you know? No, it's more like, I'm pushed into it. I'm left. I'm the only one left. I have to do it. And then that's the beautiful thing about it, though, because it's through your own effort and dealing with it that people come to love it. They don't love it first. It's rare that someone just like has to play the tuba. It's this idea, like, how do you find passion? People think it's just some thunderbolt from above saying, oh, that's my passion. No, passion usually is found after you put some effort into it and find out, like the tuba does, it shows kids their own capabilities, what they're capable of, their own possibilities. I can do this. So many people told me this is the only thing I was ever good at. It stopped me from being bullied, one guy told me. I knew who I was after I played the tuba. No one was bullied was going to push me around anymore. You know, it's like that kind of thing is such a beautiful idea. And yes, I came into this thing not knowing what I was doing. I was interviewing tuba players early on just because there's this hunch within me that says people who do something for a love of it that's positive, they have great stories. You got to follow those. Probably if you stay with it, there's going to be a great story there somewhere. And I didn't know what I was doing, but as I got into it, more immersed I got into it, more I learned about the tuba because I knew exactly zero about this instrument. Don't really care for it in some settings, honestly. I do love it in others. Sometimes I don't. You know, I just came to see this as like this enormously powerful and very important story for the United States today. We are so far removed from the tuba approach to life, which is what I call it. An approach to life that accepts discipline and hard work as just part of life, part of how you move forward. Teamwork and collaboration, again, so important. These are all the sustaining values of a community. Yeah, and we have lost a lot of that, and symptom of that is the drugs that we've spent most of this conversation talking about.
Man, what a perfect place to wrap up. I cannot thank you enough. And I'm so glad I was in the right place at the right time and, got to meet you after being in the right place at the right time and ended up with your book all those years ago. So Dreamland, once again, I have read and love. I've just started this week reading The Least of Us. And then the next book that's coming out is, you say it's The Perfect Tuba? Is that right?
Fall of next year. I'm going to have a conversation with my editor in about a half an hour about the manuscript and the cover. And so, I mean, literally, I just finished the damn thing after like a year and a half of thinking nothing, but my brain filled with tuba stuff.
Awesome. How do our listeners find you right now if they want to go to your website or anything like that?
It's at my website, which is just samquinones.com. I'm very easy to find. A Google search on my name will come up with lots of stuff like that. By the way, I'm very interested. I do lots of kind of paid speaking events, but I'm very, very interested. I have this on my contact page in doing, I've done this many, many times, probably more, well over 100 times by now. Free of charge Zoom calls with book groups, library groups, or classes, high school, university classes that read one of my books. I just was doing one the other day. Where was it? Upstate New York, and then Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Anyway, I do these all the time. I love it. I want people to feel free to reach out, and if they assign a book group or a professor assigns the book to the class, I'm more than happy to work out a time to have like a Zoom Q&A with the class. I've done it, as I say. I can't remember how many times I've done it, but I'm sure it's like close to 150 by now.
Well, from my experience with you, you were so generous with your time and happy to do this. And we can only keep what we have by giving it away. So thank you so 100%. Much, Sam. I just can't thank you enough. So have a great day, and we'll see you on the platform soon.
Wonderful, B. Thanks so much for your interest, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.